But this begs two crucial questions. Why was the great astronomical project, which Islamic astronomers began, completed in Europe and not in the Middle East? And how did knowledge of Islamic science get to Europe in the first place? The answers to these questions lie in one of the most beautiful cities on earth, the Queen of the Adriatic, Venice. Venice was founded on a swamp off the coast of Italy and felt itself separate from Europe and not bound by its laws and traditions. And as Shakespeare famously pointed out, the two most important aspects of Venice were its merchants and its long-standing links with the Arabs or Moors. It was a rich and complicated relationship, sometimes based on piracy and theft.
The story goes that in 828, two Venetian merchants stole the bones of a famous Christian saint from Venice's rival city across the water, Alexandria. The bones belonged to St. Mark the Evangelist, and they brought them back here to St. Mark's Square.
But without doubt, trade with the East brought to Venice great wealth and an exchange of ideas, customs and people, as Venice expert Vera Costantini showed me.
So this is called Campo dei Mori because, as you can see, at the corners there are statues of were called Moors.
Yeah. Oh, there's another.
Yeah, there's another one with a turban. The beard was recommended to Venetian merchants even when they went to the East. There were manuals written for Venetian merchants.
How to blend in.
How to, yes, you know, how to be respected in the East.
Yeah. Oh.
As Venetians traded more and more with their Muslim neighbours, the influence of Islam was more strongly felt. Arabic coffee culture became hugely popular, as did Islamic styles of architecture with their characteristic arches and decorations.
So the next thing I want to show you is the Palace of the Camel. When Venetians traded in the East, the unity of measurement of a load that could be loaded on a dromedary was called a carico. And it was the exactly same unity of measurement they had in the East, and it was called yoke.
So it's not coincidence that they...
No, it's not,
that they actually imported that unit of weight.
Yes, of measurement, yeah, of weight.
And with the Arabic trade came the Arabic books. The great 9th century Arabic text on algebra appeared in Latin in the 12th century. The same century saw the arrival of Arabic astronomical tables. And in the 15th century, the famous Canon of Medicine was first published in the West. And this influx of learning seems to coincide with a great historical shift. The engine of science begins to move west, from the Islamic world to Europe. That's where the great breakthroughs from the 1500s would mainly take place. I encountered an astonishing and very tangible symbol of this shift and a really surprising clue as to why it happened, thanks to Professor Angela Nuovo from the University of Udine. 20 years ago, in this library on one of the islands of Venice, Angela discovered the only surviving version of a 500-year-old book.
And what did it feel like? I mean, this is a big
yes.
discovery.
Yes, it was a great emotion. I remember it was July, very hot, like today, even hotter, and I felt cold at that moment, yes. And yes, it was a great emotion.
What she found was the very first printed copy of Islam's holy book, the Quran. This is the first time she's seen her Quran since she discovered it 20 years ago. But it struck me as strange that the world's first printed Quran was produced in Venice and not in the Islamic world. And it's obvious at first glance that it was printed by people who didn't speak Arabic very well.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawm ad-Din. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. I mean, what strikes me is that it's written in what I would regard as almost childlike handwriting. It's clumsy.
Yeah. Well, it's the first attempt to reproduce the handwriting in movable types. And as you know, the language has an enormous amount of sorts, different sorts, as, of course, every letter changes according to ligatures and the position
of course. So
in the line.
The word dhalika, which means for that, the dash should be underneath the L here, but it's above it.
Yeah.
So instead of saying dhalika, it says dhalaka, which is wrong.
Probably there were not people really of mother language in the press. So there were some errors of the mistakes in the text, which are, of course, sins.
Yes, of course. I mean, as the Quran, for every Muslim believes it's this word of God. You can't
word of
change
God.
it.
So when you change it, it's a sin.
Yes. How was it first received, do you think, when it was published?
Well, yes, the idea is that the hypothesis is, and I think it's true, that it was an enormous failure from really the business point of view, as the Muslim didn't accept the printing press for centuries, and probably the whole copies of this book were destroyed. So we don't have any other copy. Probably the only one that remained in the Western world is this book.
I felt that the failure of this printed Quran to catch on in the Islamic world spoke volumes. "800 years earlier, one reason for Islamic science's success had been the precision of the Arabic language. With over 70 different ways of writing its letters and many extra symbols to define pronunciation and meaning, it allowed scholars of many different lands to communicate in a single common language." Now, with the arrival of the printing press, scientific ideas should have been able to travel even more freely. In the West, books printed in Latin accelerated its scientific renaissance. But because of its symbols and extra letters, Arabic was much harder to set into type than Latin, and so a similar acceleration in the Islamic world failed to materialize.
I believe this rejection of the new technology, the printing press, marks the moment in history when Arabic science undergoes a seismic shift. Europe has embraced Greek and Arabic knowledge and the new technology, and Galileo and his ilk are poised at the cusp of the Renaissance.
It has been a turning point both in the history of the Venetian printing press, who used to be extremely powerful. I mean, it's the limit of expansion, let's say, and in the history of the relationship, the cultural and general relationship between the East and the West, as acceptation of printing would have meant the acceptation of the first important technology. So, you know, the two histories started to differ very much, as you know.
This initial rejection of printing was one of the many reasons that caused science in the Islamic world to fall behind the West. It coincided with a host of global changes, all of which affected the way science developed. The first and most obvious reason for the slowdown in Islamic science is that the Islamic empire itself falls into decline from the mid-1200s. One reason for this is that it's under attack from all sides. from the east are the Mongols.
In 1258, they invaded the capital, Baghdad, and it's said that the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers ran black for days with the ink of the books they'd destroyed. But trouble was also brewing in the far west of the empire. Islamic Spain, already fragmented into separate city-states, now faced a new threat, a united and determined onslaught from the Christian north.
The Reconquest, as it was called, raged for hundreds of years, but culminated in the 15th century when Ferdinand II and Isabella led an army which forced the last of the Muslims in Granada to surrender in 1492.
The Christians were intent on removing every last vestige of Islamic civilization and culture from Spain. In 1499, they ordered the burning in this square in Granada of all Arabic texts from Granada's libraries, except for a small number of medical texts. Within about 100 years, every Muslim in Spain had either been put to the sword, burnt at the stake, or banished.
And Christians from the east of Europe were intent on reclaiming the Holy Land. The Crusades.
Bent on carving out a holy Christian Levant and claiming the holy city of Jerusalem, the Crusaders launched a massive attack on northern Syria. They quickly captured this castle and turned it into one of their strongholds. Then, with ruthless and missionary zeal, they marched on Jerusalem.
And as the empire fought with its neighbours, it collapsed into warring fiefdoms. The Mamluks, slaves who originally belonged to the state of Egypt, became its leaders. The Bourbon Almohads ruled Morocco and Spain in the 13th century, and the north of Syria and Iraq splintered into a series of city-states. But for many historians of science, the biggest single reason for the decline in Islamic science was a rather famous event that took place in 1492. That year, the entire political geography of the world changed dramatically when a certain Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas.
I explain it with the phenomena of the discovery of the New World in 1492. The immediate result is that you got immense amount of gold and silver coming to the royal houses of Europe at the time, and all the adventurous empires and royal houses of the time who were setting colonies all over the world.
And science always follows the money. As the 16th and 17th centuries came and went, that money, power, and hence scientific will moved through Spain and Italy and on to Britain. By the 17th century, England, sitting at the centre of the lucrative Atlantic trade route, could afford big science. And that ultimately explains why the greatest book in world science, Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, the book that ultimately explains the motion of the sun, the moon, and the planets, was not published in Baghdad, but in London.
It was necessary for him to have data of astonishing accuracy gathered from across the world. Global inventories of numbers, observations, positions. The heights of tides, the positions of comets and planets, the rate at which pendulums beat. It's a global project. It's big science. And many of those observations, many of those mathematical models were, of course, models initially developed by Islamic astronomers in Egypt and the Near East and Central Asia.
But there's a final twist in the tale. As the wealth of the Islamic nations subsided through war, political and religious entrenchment, and the loss of its lucrative trade, so its science declined. But what this doesn't explain is why their scientific achievements have been so forgotten. And that's partly because, as Europeans colonized great swathes of the Middle East and Asia, they actively encouraged the idea that the civilizations they encountered were moribund and in decline.
It seems the English and the French were uncomfortable with subjugating people whose knowledge and science may have been as sophisticated as their own. So it became important to portray the Islamic world in a very specific way. Namely that yes, they once were very sophisticated and they had great scientists and philosophers, but of course now they've fallen into decay. Somehow this point of view made the whole colonial enterprise seem much more palatable.
One of the most fascinating developments, I think, in the history of the encounter between Western Europeans and other cultures is a kind of shift which has got fundamental and terrible consequences amongst Western Europeans when they start to reflect on why they are superior. It doesn't often cross Western Europeans' minds that they might not be superior to everybody else. For a very long time, after all, Western Europeans in general, the British for example, supposed that their superiority lay in their religion. But then I think around the 1700s, we begin to see a shift. And the shift is from claiming that the reason for European superiority is its religion to the reason for European superiority is its science and technology. Eventually it ends up with the famous phrase, we have the Gatling gun and they do not. Europeans in that period were quite prepared to acknowledge that in ancient times, Islam, for example, had achieved great things in the sciences, but they weren't doing so now. So even recent Islamic and Sanskrit astronomy was imagined to be very old, because if it was very old, it meant that the culture the British were conquering was declining. And for the British, that was clearly good news.
And some experts believe that the effect of this on Islamic scientific history is still felt in the Islamic world today.
The Islamic part and the Arab part have not yet discovered their history because their history was obliterated intentionally by the colonization period. And unfortunately, when they rediscover it now, they're rediscovering it in bits and pieces.
So today, for many different reasons, the great observatories of the medieval Islamic world are ruined husks. And it's true to say that most of the great scientific breakthroughs of the last 4 centuries have taken place in the West.